Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day, a read-along. We will be continuing our discussion of the Federalist Papers with Federalist numero 18. It should be a whole world of fun. I will note it is James Madison talking about ancient history for most of it, so you can make fun of my pronunciation when it comes to ancient republics. That being said, let's bounce on over to the read-along itself and get on into it right away. Federalist number 18, the same subject continued, the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union, for the Independent Journal, December 7th, 1787, with James Madison. I just realized tomorrow is the some kind of 100-year anniversary of this, so happy December 6th. Either way, this one is written by James Madison, though I did put a note there with help from Alexander Hamilton. They worked together on a lot of these, and this is one of the ones that has a strong smattering of Hamilton to it. I will acknowledge that the last three we've read had the same title and were written by Hamilton. And now this one and the following two also have the same title. They are all talking trash about the Articles of Confederation. I will say I did forget to change the number 16 again to number 18. I assure you it's number 18. Let's get on with it. Again, it's going to be a lot of a history lesson here, so forgive my pronunciations. To the people of the state of New York, as always. Bring this up here. Okay, one sentence at a time. If this is your first time coming to Founder of the Day, doing these read-alongs, we go one sentence at a time and really break down what they're trying to tell us in the Federalist Papers. Among the confederacies of antiquity, the most considerable was that of the Grecian republics. I know it's Greco-Roman wrestling. The Grecian republics associated under the Amphitheonic Council. From the best accounts transmitted of this celebrated institution, it bore a very instructive analogy to the present confederation of the American states. So we are going back to ancient Greece and discussing the republics. He does note here the best accounts transmitted of this institution, because it's ancient history, and while there was writing, there are certain questions out there, but we're going to go, Madison's going to go with what he knew at the time, which should be pretty similar to what we know now, though we have done many archaeological digs. When it comes to the governing itself, that probably hasn't changed a whole bunch. The members retained the character of independent and sovereign states, and had equal votes in the Federal Council. This we do know. In ancient Greece, they were city-states, and they each had they ran themselves, but they did have a, as it says here, he calls it a Federal Council. I'm sure they would have called it something different, but they were united as allies, but had no say in each other's actual workings. Next sentence here. Okay. This council had a general authority to propose and resolve whatever it judged necessary for the common welfare of Greece, to declare and carry on war, to decide in the last resort all controversies between the members, to find the aggressing party, to employ the whole force of the Confederacy against the disobedient, to admit new members. So pointing out here that, from his understanding, the Greek General Council could do things as we might think a nation today, declaring war. The important part is sorting out controversies between members, fining parties that. So if you invaded your city-state neighbor, the General Council could fine you. To employ the whole force of the Confederacy against the disobedient, and to admit new members. So really focusing on not only the carrying on of war here, but the punishing of states that don't follow the rules of the Greek Confederacy. The Amphitheons were the guardians of religion and of the immense riches belonging to the Temple of Delphos, where they had the right of jurisdiction in controversies between the inhabitants and those who came to consult the oracle. So the Amphitheons, probably pronouncing that wrong, the Amphitheons, guardians of the religion. So whenever someone came from a different city-state to consult the oracle, one of the holy figures, they were in charge of what happened there. As a further provision for the efficacy of the federal powers, they took an oath mutually to defend and protect the united cities, to punish the violators of this oath, and to inflict vengeance on sacred despoilers of the temple. So, again, the federal government was allowed to protect essentially the church, as the ancient Greeks knew it. They, of course, didn't call it a church. It was polytheistic, had nothing to do with what we now consider the church, but still, that's where we're at. Hair is bothering me because I had a hat on all day. This is going to happen in the wintertime. Oh, man, this one hair. Anyway, in theory and upon paper, this apparatus of power seems amply sufficient for all general purposes. In several material instances, they exceed the powers enumerated in the Articles of Confederation. So, looking at the way that the ancient Greeks ran their federal government, it appears that they would have acted as the Constitution as opposed to the Articles of Confederation. It exceeds the enumerated powers. Oops. The Amphitheonians had in their hands the superstition of the times, one of the principal engines by which government was then maintained. They had a declared authority to use coercion against refractory cities, and were bound by oath to exert this authority on the necessary occasions. So, the Amphitheonians were the ones in charge of this united government, and if a city-state, again, repeating, if a city-state disobeyed, they could bring the hammer of justice down upon them. Very different, nevertheless, was the experiment from the theory. Interesting. So this is what, in theory, they could do, but what happened in actuality, James Madison? The powers, like those of the present Congress, were administered by deputies appointed wholly by the cities in their political capacities, and exercised over them in the same capacities. So they were appointed by the separate city-states. Hence, the weakness, the disorders, and finally the destruction of the Confederacy. Okay, so he's jumping right to the conclusion that it was the separate city-states appointing their representatives that led to weakness and disorders, and what led to the downfall of ancient Greece, which is a bold statement. I am not nearly as knowledgeable about ancient Greece as I am about the American Revolution. I have been actually reading a good deal about it lately, but that is not my understanding of how things went down. The more powerful members, instead of being kept in awe and subordination, tyrannized successively over all the rest. Okay, that makes sense. The bigger, more powerful states essentially took over the other states. Athens, as we learn from Demosthenes, was the arbiter of Greeks 73 years. So Athens was in charge for almost a century. The Lacedaemonians next governed it 29 years. At a subsequent period, after the Battle of Leuctra, the Thebans had their turn of domination. So one after another, the different city-states would take over the power and essentially dominate the ancient Greek councils. It happened but too often, according to Plutarch, that the deputies of the strongest cities awed and corrupted those of the weaker, and that judgment went in favor of the most powerful party. So, as he's saying, the more powerful states would not only dominate because they were more powerful, and the other middling states would agree with them, and unfortunately this would lead to the suppression of the desires of certain cities. Again, when he says cities, he means city-states, because there were just less people back then, and they were essentially, a city was a population center that would be comparable to a state, though not in population or power or anything like that. It's a very strange comparison. Even in the midst of defensive and dangerous wars with Persia and Macedon, the members never acted in concert, and were, more or fewer of them, eternally the dupes or the hirelings of the common enemy. So They didn't work together very well and were taken advantage of. The intervals of foreign war were filled up by domestic vicissitudes, convulsions, and carnage. So when they weren't at war with random neighbors, they were at war between themselves. After the conclusion of the war with Xerxes, it appears that the Lacedaemonians required that a number of the cities should be turned out of the Confederacy for the unfaithful part they had acted. So Xerxes is pretty famous because of the movie 300, but what he's saying here is they decided after they lost the war to Xerxes, or fought in the war with Xerxes, they decided they had to get rid of some of the dissenting opinions in the Congress. The Athenians, finding that the Lacedaemonians would lose fewer partisans by such a measure than themselves and would become masters of public deliberations, vigorously opposed and defeated the attempt. So Athens didn't like this one bit, and when the Lacedaemonians tried to remove certain smaller city-states from the Greek council, Athens stepped up and said, no, you're just trying to take power for yourself, not acceptable. This piece of history proves at once the inefficiency of the Union, the ambition and jealousy of its most powerful members, and the dependent and degraded condition of the rest. So, using this as an example, and this is kind of repetitive. Now, we've essentially gone through exactly this argument 3 or 4 times throughout the Federalist Papers, just going back to different points of history. Last time, in number 17, Hamilton was talking about how feudal kings went through exactly the same thing. They're just trying to pick out more examples of history. Essentially, every democracy in history or republican history, they're trying to pick out and use an example as why the Constitution would be better than the Articles of Confederation. The smaller members, though entitled by the theory of their system to revolve in equal pride and majesty around the common center, had become, in fact, satellites of the orbits of the primary magnitude. So, very fun way to put it. These smaller city-states were just next to the larger, more powerful states and had to find larger, more powerful states to align themselves with. The argument here, he is comparing ancient Greece to, as we've been discussing, the Articles of Confederation and the fear that this is what would happen. Your Rhode Islands and your Delawares would simply be neighboring your Massachusettses and your Virginias. It would have to orbit in their, or be satellites in their orbit, as he said. Had the Greeks, says the Abbé Millot, been wise as they were courageous, they would have been admonished by experience of the necessity of a closer union, and would have availed themselves of the peace which followed their success against the Persian arms to establish such a reformation. So, if the Greeks weren't such dummies, they would have united under a more stronger federal union, just like we're saying we should. Instead of this obvious policy, Athens and Sparta, inflated with victories and the glory they had acquired, became first rivals and then enemies, and did each other indefinitely more mischief than they had suffered from Xerxes. So because it wasn't one strong union, and Athens and Sparta were 2 of the powerful city-states, and the other city-states were just revolving around the sides and taking sides, whichever one helped them that day, well, then Athens and Sparta ended up going to war with each other. A kind of warning they are putting out for the Articles of Confederation. Their mutual jealousies, fears, hatreds, and injuries ended in the celebrated Peloponnesian War, which itself ended in the ruin and slavery of the Athenians who began it. So it was the cockiest, strongest city-state that started the war, and boy did that not work out. And they lost, and they became enslaved to the Spartans and their allies. Again, I'm going to point out once again that this is a James Madison paper, but as I said earlier, Hamilton definitely helped write parts of this, and you can see it in the cockiness. We've read enough Hamilton here to know he could be a little bit cocky. Calling it the obvious policy had they been as wise as they were courageous. So if they weren't dumb and could see the obvious, right, that's a real Hamilton way to say things. As a weak government, when not at war, is ever agitated by internal dissensions, so these never fail to bring on fresh calamities from abroad. So because if there's no war going on, then these different powerful states are going to get angry at each other. Well, eventually, someone's going to invade, taking advantage of that weakness. The Phoenicians, having plowed up some consecrated ground belonging to the temple of Apollo, the Amphitheonic Council, according to the superstition of the age, imposed a fine on the sacrilegious offenders. Again, as we stated earlier, the Amphitheonic Council was the one in charge of the church and the oracle and the religions, and the Phoenicians did something that bothered the gods, and the council put a fine on them. And what happened? The Phoenicians, being abetted by Athens and Sparta, refused to submit to the decree. Because why are we're not gonna pay? Nah. Neither Athens or Sparta want to start a war with us. They're already at war with each other. We're just not going to pay our bills. Much like was happening under the Articles of Confederation, and this would have been familiar to anyone reading it at the time. The Thebans, with others of the cities, undertook to maintain the authority of the Amphictyons and to avenge the violated god. So the Thebans, a smaller city-state, and some of the other even smaller city-states said, let's get together. We are not going to let them embarrass us like this. The latter, being the weaker party, invited the assistance of Philip of Macedon, who had secretly fostered the contest. So they looked for the help with Philip of Macedon. I don't believe Macedon was a city-state at this point, but they said, hey, Philip, can you help us? Turns out Philip was the one tricking people into going to war in the first place. So, what happened? Philip gladly seized the opportunity of executing the designs he had long planned against the liberties of Greece. He said, yeah, I'll definitely help you invade your neighboring city-states. Just you. I'll help you, a city-state, fight your other city-state. And I'm just doing it to be nice. I'm not doing it to fight all the city-states, that's for sure. I'm not doing it to divide you. Trust me, I'm Philip of Macedon. By his intrigues and bribes, he won over to his interests the popular leaders of several cities. By their influence and votes, gained admission into the Amphitheonic Council, and by his arts and his arms, made himself master of the Confederacy. So not only did he jump in to help, but once he was helping, he said, hey, can I be a city-state too? And they said, sure, you obviously like it here. And once he was there, he was put on the council, and then he used that position to put himself in charge of the council. Now, again, I'm not really an expert in any fashion on Greek history, but I'm under the impression the Amphitheonic Council is the council of the Greek city-states. So he actually takes over as leader of the city-states. He did this by dividing the city-states on purpose, offering to help some of the city-states he divided. Once he helped them suppress their neighboring states, he was then able to sneak his way onto the governing council and then take over the Greek council of all the separate city-states. Such were the consequences of the fallacious principle on which this interesting establishment was founded. So, this is what happened. These are the consequences. This is how it happened. Had Greece, says a judicious observer on her fate, been united by a stricter confederation and preserved into her union, she would never have worn the chains of Macedon and might have proved a barrier to the vast projects of Rome. I don't know who the judicious observer of her fate is. Perhaps it would be well known to people of the American Revolution, though I doubt everyone reading this was as well studied on ancient history as James Madison was. Had she been stricter, a better union, if she had the United States Constitution, could have avoided this. And it's interesting, she never worn the chains of Macedon, which he is actually blaming on. He is actually saying that is what led it to not be able to withstand Rome once Rome ends up growing and taking over the Greek area. Interesting. Take a quick sip. Excuse me. The Achaean League, as it was called, was another society of Grecian republics, which supplies us with valuable instruction. So here's a different league of Greek nation states. The union here was far more intimate, and its organization much wiser than in the preceding instance. It will accordingly appear that though not exempt from a similar catastrophe, it by no means equally deserved it. So, as opposed to the, I can't remember how to pronounce it without reading it. As opposed to the Amphitheonic Council, the Achaean League seems to have been organized much better. Although he notes here, even though it ends the same way, this one didn't deserve it. The first one deserved it because they did it not the way we want to. This one didn't deserve it because it did things the way we want to, even though it also failed. The cities composing this league, the Achaean League in ancient Greece, retained their municipal jurisdiction, appointed their own officers, and enjoyed a perfect equality. So again, the cities are the city-states of ancient Greece, saying they enjoyed perfect equality. Oh, we got a long sentence here. The Senate, in which they were represented, had the sole and exclusive right of peace and war, of sending and receiving ambassadors, of entering into treaties and alliances, of appointing a chief magistrate or praetor, as he was called, who commanded their armies, and who, with the advice and consent of 10 of the senators, not only administered the government in the recess of the Senate, but had a great share in its deliberations when assembled. So you can see why Hamilton and Madison like the Achaeans better. This one top-level government was able to make war and peace, was in charge of ambassadors, negotiating with other nations, making treaties. Chief magistrate, or praetor as he was called, basically a commander-in-chief who ran the armies. The Senate did have a say in what this ancient Greek council would do, and especially what the commander-in-chief would do, but things actually got done because it was more united front. According to the primitive constitution, there were 2 praetors associated with the administration, but on trial, a single one was preferred. So there were 2 commanders-in-chief, but on trial, a single one was preferred. Interesting. Anyway, not gonna linger on that too much. It appears that the cities had all the same laws and customs, the same weights and measures, and the same money. So in the Achaean League, each separate city-state, they were separate, but they had the same laws. They were very similar in the way people carried themselves. They had the same money. They were essentially the same, despite being different. But how far this effect proceeded from the authority of the Federal Council is left uncertain. So whether or not this was the Federal Achaean League, the top-level government, telling the city-states this is how they should operate, or whether the city-states just kind of naturally decided to operate in similar manners, is not unknown. It is said only that the cities were in a manner compelled to receive the same laws and usages. So it is said that the cities were compelled, so they had to follow the same laws, but they didn't have to behave in the same manner, probably. When Lacedaemon was brought into the league by told you I had trouble with some of these names. When Lacedaemon was brought into the league by Philopoemen, it was attended with an abolition of the institutions and laws of Lycurgus and an adoption of those of the Achaeans. So, when a new city-state was brought in to the Achaean League, it was the laws and institutions were abolished, and then they had to follow the new laws of the union they were joining. The Amphitheonic Confederacy, of which she had been a member, left her in the full exercise of government and legislation. So again, with the Amphitheonic Council, I guess Lacedaemon left this council where it had all of the abilities to run all its own things, and then joined the Achaean League, instead taking on the laws of the Achaean League instead of her own. This circumstance alone proves a very material difference in the genius of the two systems. Okay, so apparently that means a lot to James Madison and Alexander Hamilton for the material difference. Obviously, materially they behaved in very different manners when it came to the federal government giving, or what they're alluding to as a federal government, the International Council, the Achaean League versus the Amphitheonic League. They operated very differently. Sure. I don't see how one is better than the other yet. Let's see what they tell us. It is much to be regretted that such an imperfect... I'm sorry. Let's cut this down one sentence at a time. It is much to be regretted that such imperfect monuments remain of this curious political fabric. So, we don't know everything about these nation states. Could its interior structure and the regular operation be ascertained, it is probable that more light would be thrown by it on the science of federal government than by any of the like experiments with which we are acquainted. So if we knew more about these ancient Greek nations, we'd probably be able to, what he's saying here is we study history so we not only don't repeat the mistakes of the past, but we learn from them and improve on them. If we knew more about these city-states, we probably could learn a lot. We've gone through most of a pretty lengthy anti-federalist paper, Federalist paper at this point, and only now are we acknowledging that there's not a whole lot we can learn from it. Thanks, guys. One important fact seems to be witnessed by all the historians who take notice of Achaean affairs. Okay, what's this important fact? It is that as well after the renovation of the League by Aratus, as before its dissolution by the arts of Macedon, there was infinitely more moderation and justice in the administration of its government, and less of violence and sedition in the people, than were to be found in any of the cities exercising singly all the prerogatives of sovereignty. So, there were less revolts from within. More moderation and justice in the ministry. So the governments were better, and there was less revolt from within. When there was they were all united under one league, as opposed to when they operated individually and took care of their own affairs. It's very interesting how he phrases that. He seems to be stating that there was less violence and sedition in a big, when the separate states united under a league or a confederacy. He's implying it's because there was more moderation, which implies that the people were happier under these moderate and just governments, and therefore they had no reason for violence and sedition. But that's an assumption. He only just said how we don't know a whole lot about how it operated. So I'm here thinking, why couldn't they... Perhaps they were being suppressed and didn't have the opportunity to be seditious at the time. We don't know. As Madison just acknowledged, we don't actually know what the case was. It's a very big leap he's taking there. As always, I haven't said it yet today, but as always, this is propaganda. The Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers were propaganda attempting to convince people to vote for or against ratification of the Constitution. Okay. The Abbé Mably, in his Observations on Greece, says that the popular government, which was so tempestuous elsewhere, caused no disorders in the members of the Achaean Republic, because it was there tempered by the general authority and laws of the Confederacy. His capitals, not mine. This is a reference to the Abbe Mably. I'm not even entirely sure who the Abbe Mably is. I will look into that. Certainly seems to be a student of ancient Greece, and Madison is relying on his work to note that the claim is there was no revolutions. When he says disorders, there was no revolts or insurrections from within, because it was there tempered by the general authority and laws of the Confederacy. Because the Confederacy was making sure the people didn't revolt, as opposed to the individual Greek city-states. Seems to be kind of a bold claim, considering, again, Madison just acknowledged that we don't have enough information to know for sure. We are not to conclude too hastily, however, that faction did not, in a certain degree, agitate the particular cities, much less than a due subordination and harmony reign in the general system. We are not, let me read that again, because I was basically just saying this. We are not to conclude too hastily, however, that faction did not, in a certain degree, agitate the particular cities, much less that a due subordination and harmony reigned in the general system. So we shouldn't just go about saying that there weren't disagreements and there weren't parties, and in the different city-states there weren't arguments, much less a due subordination, and harmony. So we shouldn't just assume that the people weren't upset about what's going on. The contrary is sufficiently displayed in the vicissitudes and fate of the Republic. So not only we shouldn't assume that they were all harmonious and following the laws of the General Council. No, the Greek Republic eventually falls apart, and therefore they weren't very happy, despite what we were just being implied in the previous section. Now again, I am going to repeat, I am not as well informed on ancient Greece as I am about the American Revolution. I know a little about it, and I know about the Federalist Papers. At this point, we've read through 18. We could see how they're using this. They're using the knowledge that they don't have about ancient Greece and making a little bit of. They're not even making assumptions. They make the assumption, then they say, well, but again, we don't know for sure. Like, okay. Whilst the Amphitheonic Confederacy remained, that of the Achaeans, which comprehended the less important cities only, made little figure on the theater of Greece. Okay, so while the Amphitheonic and Achaean cities were around at, or leagues were around at the same time, the Achaeans weren't as powerful or important. When the former became a victim to Macedon, the latter was spared by the policy of Philip and Alexander. So that's in reference to Alexander the Great and his father Philip, who eventually conquered the Achaean city-states, but the Amphitheonic Confederacy was not conquered by them. Under the successors of these princes, however, a different policy prevailed, so things changed later on. The arts of division were practiced among the Achaeans. So, okay, so wait. The former became a victim. I'm sorry. When the Amphitheonic Confederacy became a victim of Philip and Alexander the Great, the Achaeans were fine. Remember, earlier we had discussed how the Amphitheonic Confederacy was not very united, and the separate city-states basically took care of themselves, and Philip of Macedon used this to divide them, eventually help some of them go to war with other ones, join the league himself, and then become leader of the league. That's how he got rid of the Amphitheonic. However, the art of division was, after he took over the Amphitheonic, the Achaeans were still around. And then the art of division was practiced amongst the Achaeans. Each city was seduced into a separate interest. The union was dissolved. So they started to divide the Achaean cities, and that helped lead to its downfall, despite having this very strong federal union that we've been discussing this entire time. Some of the cities fell under the tyranny of Macedonian garrisons. others under that of usurpers springing out of their own confusions. So the Macedonians started invading some of the Achaeans, this powerful constitution that Madison and Hamilton are very much excited about. Didn't work, and certain ones were invaded, while others, because what was going on, they had internal changes and people throwing off the leaders of the separate cities. Shame and oppression ere long awakened their love of liberty. So they were embarrassed and they remembered how great things used to be. A few cities reunited because how great things used to be. Their example was followed by others as opportunities were found of cutting off their tyrants. So when they were able to throw off their tyrants, they ran right back to the Achaean League. The League soon embraced almost the whole Peloponnesus. That's the island and archipelago down there in ancient Greece, essentially the landmass of ancient Greece. Macedon saw its progress, but was hindered by internal dissensions from stopping it. So they saw what was going on, but because Macedon was now having problems within, they couldn't do it. Which is probably why these city-states had the opportunity to throw off Macedon's invasion in the first place. All Greece caught the enthusiasm and seemed ready to unite in one confederacy when the jealousy and envy in Sparta and Athens of the rising glory of the Chians threw a fatal damp on the enterprise. So Sparta and Athens, because they wanted to take care of themselves and didn't want to be part of a powerful union that told them what to do, well, they ruined the whole thing now, didn't they? The dread of the Macedonian power induces the League to court the alliance of the kings of Egypt and Syria, who, as successors of Alexander, were rivals of the king of Macedon. So Alexander the Great conquered most of what was the known world here. They're kind of blaming it on the different types of unions that, these two ancient Greek councils. But Alexander the Great conquered essentially everyone, so really their type of government wouldn't have mattered entirely that much. But what he says here, it broke into 3 leagues. So basically, Alexander the Great conquers most of the known world, including a big chunk of Europe, big chunk of Africa, mostly Egypt, and then a big chunk of the Middle East and Persia. Then he passes away pretty young, and that is broken into 3 different kingdoms. The names escape me, I apologize. But it's the Middle East, Egypt, and then the European part. Now, despite that, the other 2 kingdoms were still afraid of Macedonia. The European kingdom is what he's saying here. This policy was defeated. Oh, where's this in? This policy was defeated by Cleomenes, king of Sparta, who was led by his ambition to make an unprovoked attack on his neighbors, the Achaeans, and who, as an enemy of Macedon, had interest enough with the Egyptian and Syrian princes to effect a breach of their engagements with the League. So, the Achaeans were trying to unite. Sparta said, no, we don't want to be your puppet. Sparta was friendly with Egypt and Syria, and Sparta thought it could work with these allies to fight off both Macedon and to suddenly, out of nowhere, attack the Achaeans, which destroyed the Achaean League. The Achaeans were now reduced to the dilemma of submitting to Cleomenes or of supplicating to the aid of Macedon, its former oppressor. So the Achaeans were said, okay, we either have to do what Sparta wants, or we can go ask Macedon for help, even though Macedon had not so long ago invaded us, and we had to throw them off. The latter expedient was adopted, so let's go ask our former oppressor to come take care of us again, please. The contests of the Greeks always afforded a pleasing opportunity to that powerful neighbor of intermeddling in their affairs. So we've been talking about Macedon this whole time now. They were always happy to jump in and get the Greek city-states to fight with each other so that they could take over one or all of the city-states themselves. Macedonian army quickly appeared. Cleomenes vanished. So the Macedonians came to help. Sparta ran away. Not usually how we think about Sparta nowadays. The Achaeans soon experienced, as often happens, that a victorious and powerful ally is but another name for a master. So, great, we invited our oppressor back to help, and now they're oppressing us after they helped. All that their most abject compliances could obtain from him was a toleration of the exercise of their laws. So all they could get was Macedon saying, yeah, you can make your own laws, it's fine. Philip, who was now on the throne of Macedon, soon provoked by his tyrannies fresh combinations among the Greeks. So he went and kept dividing them and kept doing the same stuff Macedon's been doing this whole Federalist paper. The Achaeans, though weakened by internal dissensions and by the revolt of Mesne, one of its members, being joined by the Aetolians and Athenians, erected the standard of opposition. So the Achaeans had been weakened, but they united with some of the other city-states to like make sure Macedon didn't too much wrong. Whew. Finding themselves, though thus supported, unequal to the undertaking, they once more had recourse to the dangerous expedient of introducing the succor of foreign arms. Okay, so now they got their friends on board and they had to fight off more people, but they had to ask, they couldn't fight off Macedon, so the Romans, to whom the invitation was made, eagerly embraced it. So now Macedon has taken over so powerfully. This is a really fun history lesson. It is not American Revolution at all, but thank you, James Madison. This is a lot of fun. So Macedon, I'm going to go back through this at the end because there's a lot going on here. They couldn't throw off Macedon with the help of other Greek city-states, so they had to go get the Romans to help. Philip was conquered, Macedon subdued, so the Romans helped. A new crisis ensued. Dissensions broke out among its members. The Romans fostered Callicrates, and other popular leaders became mercenary instruments for inveighling their countrymen. The more effectually to nourish discord and disorder the Romans had, to the astonishment of those who confided in their sincerity, already proclaimed universal liberty throughout Greece. Okay, with the same insidious views, they now seduce the members from the League by representing it to their pride, the violation it committed on their sovereignty. So Rome ends up now, since they came to help, doing exactly what Macedon did and suppressing the people they came to help. The Greeks stand up and say, hey, this is garbage, don't do this. By these arts, this union, the last hope of Greece, the last hope of ancient liberty, was torn into pieces, and such imbecility and distraction introduced that the arms of Rome found little difficulty in completing the ruin which their arts had commenced. The Achaeans were cut to pieces, and Achaia loaded with chains, under which it is groaning at this hour. Okay, one more part. Let me take a sip of water here. There's a lot going on. I have thought it not superfluous to give the outlines of this important portion of history, both because it teaches more than one lesson, and because, as a supplement to the outlines of the Achaean constitution, it emphatically illustrates the tendency of federal bodies rather to anarchy among the members than to tyranny in the head. That's where you were going with this? Okay. So he's saying, in conclusion, don't be afraid of the federal government becoming a tyrannical government. There's a better chance the Constitution will lead to anarchy. I'm going to bring myself back up here, and we are going... Publius. I forgot. I got to end with Publius. I'm going to bring myself back up here. Where's the word? I can't, for whatever reason, I've never been able to pronounce this one particular word. There it is. It's the name of the Confederacy. I keep passing it. The Amphitheonic Confederacy. So, the Federalists get to me sometimes, obviously. Just to recap, what they were saying is there were two confederacies in ancient Greece at the same time. The Amphitheonic Confederacy and the Achaeans, or the Achaean League. The Amphitheonic Confederacy is the one we are more familiar with generally, Athens in Greece, and a bunch of other city-states. The Achaeans were separate city-states in the area. The Amphitheonic Confederacy with Sparta in Greece, they were left to their own devices, kind of like the Articles of Confederation. You can do whatever you want in your city-state, whatever laws you desire, blah, blah, blah. We have a weak government. The Achaeans, on the other hand, were city-states that all followed the Achaean government. That's why, they're called the Achaeans, and the other ones are called the Amphitheonic League, because that was a league of sovereign states that were friends. The Achaeans had, the main Achaean government passed down the laws to the separate city-states that then went down to the people. Basically, with Madison, and this one has a lot, as I said earlier, has a lot of Hamilton's hands on it. Basically, he's saying, he literally says, actually, I'm not going to say basically, literally says the Achaeans didn't deserve what happened, and the Amphitheonic did. The thing is, in both scenarios, the same result happened. Both were conquered by Macedonia, or Macedon. I'm sorry, he's referencing this Macedon. I usually call it Macedonia. It's how we generally talk about it today. They were both conquered. It didn't help. Now, it's a fun history lesson, though. It is a lot of fun. We're not talking about the American Revolution today at all. The Amphitheonic are invaded. They're saying they're invaded very easily because they're separate city-states. So what Philip of Macedon did, who I believe is Alexander the Great's father. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it's his father. Philip of Macedon goes to the Amphitheonic Confederacy, who were not very strongly tied together, and he sends his minions out to whisper to the different city-states and make them angry at each other, and eventually they break out into little wars. And then one of these city-states needs some help, so they go to Philip of Macedon and say, Philip, can you help us beat our friends within our league? And Philip goes, yeah, definitely, just because I'm a nice guy. And then he shows up, he helps them win the war, and then he says, hey, you think I can be one of the city-states? And they're like, yeah, you're a really nice guy. You could definitely join in. And then he takes advantage of that and becomes leader of the city-states, and it seems like they're saying essentially leads to tyranny and oppression for all of the city-states. Some of them rebel at certain points, but it doesn't seem to work. Now the Achaeans next door, Philip goes over and just kind of invades. Basically, he just goes and invades them. Again, the Achaeans are the ones that Madison and Hamilton want the Constitution to be like, because they're united and should be able to throw off oppressors, but they don't. He just, instead of being sneaky and having to work for the tyranny, he just goes over and invades the Achaeans. The Achaeans then have to ask Rome, eventually there are internal divisions in Macedon that the invaded Achaeans, the separate city-states in Achaean, they work together and seem to be able to pretty much throw him off. Then he gets his act together, and Macedon comes back and re-invades. This time, I apologize. First, they asked for help. Yes, they asked for help from Macedon to unite or fight against some of the other Sparta. Sparta came to invade. That's right. Sparta had the help of Egypt and Syria and came to invade. So they say, hey, Macedon, we just throw you off because you were a tyrant and we hated you, but we need your help. Can you come help? Yeah. And then he comes back and then he's a tyrant again. So then then the Achaeans go ask Rome, which is an up-and-coming nation, to help. And Rome says, sure. And they throw up Philip of Macedon, but turns out they then take over and act tyrannical, and this is essentially what dissolves the Greek city-states. So that is a lot of fun, but it doesn't seem to be the best argument for what's wrong with the Articles of Confederation and what's right about the Constitution. Like, they literally say that it took a lot of effort to overthrow the Amphitheonic Confederacy, which is akin to the Articles of Confederation, and it was fairly easy to stampede through the Achaeans, which is akin to the Constitution. Let me know if I'm getting if you disagree with my interpretation of what we're reading here, but either way, boy, was that a lot of fun to learn. That about does it for Federalist number 18. Again, I have the wrong number on the side. I always forget to do something when I update these. Forgot to update the number on the last screen, but I assure you this was number 18. Next week we will be talking about number 19. My name is Jason. I appreciate you being here. I am your humble and obedient servant, and I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.